Hello, everybody, and welcome to Network 2020's virtual briefing on the topic today of Closer to Midnight, the return to a nuclear arms race. I am Joanna Gvozdowski, Senior Program Advisor at the network, and I will be moderating our discussion today. First, for some of you who may not be familiar with Network 2020, we are an inclusive international community that bridges the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds. We provide a number of different programming, so if you are interested, please have a look at our website to see our various offerings. Now, I have the great pleasure to introduce today's panelists. We'll start first with Miss Alexandra Bell. She is President and Chief Executive, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. A noted policy expert and former diplomat, she oversees the Bulletin's publishing programs, management of the Doomsday Clock, and the growing set of activities around nuclear risk. Before joining the Bulletin, Ms. Bell served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Affairs within the State Department. Her other professional experiences include positions with the Plowshare Fund and the Center for American Progress, amongst others. Now, Ambassador Stephen Pifer is an affiliate of Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, as well as a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution. A retired Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Pifer's more than 25 years with the State Department included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine, as well as Ambassador to Ukraine, amongst others. He served at the U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as with the delegation to the negotiation on intermediate-range nuclear forces in Geneva. In addition, Ambassador Pifer was a William Perry Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Our third speaker is Dr. Tong Zhao. He is a senior fellow with the Nuclear Policy Program and Carnegie, China. He is also a non-resident researcher at the Science and Global Security Program at Princeton University and associate editor of the journal Science and Global Security. Previously, Dr. Zhao was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at Harvard University and worked for the Office of Foreign Affairs of the People's Government of Beijing Municipality. He is the author of numerous publications, including The Political Drivers of China's Changing Nuclear Policy, Implications for U.S.-China Nuclear Relations and International Security. So welcome to all our participants today for our speakers. So let's begin. Are we currently witnessing a return to a nuclear arms race? The Washington-based Arms Control Association recently posted that the global nuclear security environment could hardly be more precarious. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has set its doomsday clock to the closest it has ever been to midnight. Russia recently updated its nuclear weapons doctrine, and the New START treaty expires next year, with little expectation that either the U.S. or Russia will be willing to extend it. China, meanwhile, has been rapidly growing its nuclear arsenal, appearing to play catch-up with both the U.S. and Russia's stockpiles. Additional nuclear players, such as North Korea and Iran, continue progress with their nuclear programs. Will such developments lead to greater geopolitical instability, particularly in relations between the U.S., Russia, and China? Is there a greater likelihood that nuclear weapons could be used? Are there any possibilities or desire to create new frameworks or treaties to prevent the use of such weapons? I look forward to discussing these and other questions with our panelists today. So if I may start with you, Alexandra, a little bit to set the scene, could you very briefly provide a summary about arms control and nuclear threats over the past decade? And why has your organization recently moved the doomsday clock closer to midnight?
Thanks so much, Joanna, and thanks everyone for tuning in. This is a critically important issue area that we need more participation, a wider group of people talking about these. So glad to be here. In a nutshell, the nuclear threat has become worse and more complex over the past decade. following Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, hopes of a follow-on to the New START treaty has dwindled. No progress was made during the first Trump administration to advance forward on U.S.-Russia strategic stability talks. In the Biden administration, we did have a series of such talks extending through 2021. But unfortunately, in early 2022, Russia chose war over stability. And now New START is on life support. It will expire in less than a year. There is no legal mechanism to actually extend that treaty in order to keep the kind of guardrails that we and the Russians have had in place for over 50 years. We would need to create an entirely new agreement. With China, we're seeing a massive nuclear buildup. Though the Chinese continue to deny that buildup, they also refuse to engage in substantive discussions on nuclear risk reduction, though to be clear, they have been more willing to engage than the Russians have been, particularly in the multilateral P5 format. Multilateral arms control is also under duress, with increasing threats to norms, including those to prohibit nuclear explosive testing. There's also an inability to create new structures at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. It's for those reasons and more that the bulletin moved the Doomsday Clock the closest it's ever been to midnight, and that's 89 seconds to midnight. This was intended as an unmistakable warning that every second of delay in reversing course from our current conditions increases the probability of global disaster. That said, we are capable of changing our fate. The United States, Russia, China, they do have the collective power to destroy civilization. These three countries have the prime responsibility for that reason to pull the world back from the brink. And they can do so if their leaders seriously commence good faith discussions around the global threats that we're going to talk about today. Despite the profound disagreements we're seeing, slight signals that new dialogues may begin, but words aren't enough. We're going to need to see action. And that's what we really need to focus on and demand of our leaders.
Right, thank you very much. So now, if I could turn to you, Steve, can you please discuss drilling down the U.S.-Russia arms control relationship under Putin and the status of New START, and what has been the impact of the war in Ukraine on this nuclear relationship? Oh, you're on mute.
Good point. The U.S. arms control relationship has really deteriorated since the Russian invasion in 2022. And I think there was actually a mistake made on the American side, as the American side suspended business as usual. Unfortunately, that included the strategic stability talks. I think those were an area where you should have kept up contact with Moscow, because that containing that nuclear competition, I think, is so important. Now, a year later, the administration reversed course and said it was ready for talks with Russia on nuclear risk reduction, and also on a follow-on treaty to the New START treaty, which expires, as Alex said, in 2026. And then the Russians made a mistake. They refused to engage and tied any kind of conversations on risk reduction or arms control to what they called the broader US-Russia relationship. And it really reflected Russian unhappiness about American support, including military assistance to Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war. And so that Russian linkage really has frozen the dialogue now for the last couple of years. I think there's a question now with what the Trump administration is trying to do with Russia. Will that somehow delink the issue so that, in fact, an arms control dialogue might proceed? On New START, in 2023, the Russians said that they were suspending their participation in the treaty. And what that meant was they were no longer going to carry out the data exchanges, the notifications, the on-site inspections that are crucial to monitoring the treaty. But they did say that they would continue to observe New START's 3 numerical limits. Several months later, the United States said basically, well, if Russia's not going to do this, we will not do this either. So you have a situation where both sides now say they are observing the 3 numerical limits, but no one's exchanging notifications or data or conducting on-site inspections. Now, I think 2 of the limits, the limit on the total number of launchers for strategic ballistic missiles and the total number of heavy bombers, and also a second limit on deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, deployed submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and deployed heavy bombers. Those two limits can probably be monitored independently by the sides using what we call national technical means of verification. That's things like spy satellites. But the third limit, which I think is the most important, the limit on deployed strategic warheads, the actual number of warheads that are there, that can't be monitored without notifications and on-site inspections. And in January, the State Department released its report, which said it now believes that the Russians may have exceeded the 1,550 limit on deployed strategic warheads, although not by a major amount. But the problem is, without the inspection mechanisms, neither side really knows. Now, the issue, as Alex said, becomes moot in February of 2026 when the treaty expires. But I do think we are now entering a period of arms racing. I mean, Tong will talk to the Chinese approach, but there's a lot of concern now in the Pentagon in Washington about the Chinese nuclear buildup, where China, from several years ago, where it had maybe 300 to 400 nuclear warheads, about the same as France and UK. And the UK is now building up. The Pentagon expects China to build up to 1,000 nuclear warheads in 2030. And that's driving concern in Washington. We saw it a bit over a year ago when the congressionally mandated Strategic Posture Commission put out a report, which basically said that in light of what they call the two-peer nuclear challenge, that's Russia on one side, China on the other, the United States should be planning or should develop plans to build more ballistic missile submarines, more intercontinental ballistic missiles, more heavy bombers, sea-launched cruise missiles. I personally think that that paper was worthless as a guide for action because it gave priority to everything. And there's also, I think, some fairly significant limits imposed by the US industrial base. But what the United States can do and could do in the short to medium term is it could add warheads to existing missiles. So under the terms of the New START treaty, to get below that 1,550 limit, the US military took a lot of warheads off of missiles. Those warheads went into storage. So the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile now carries one warhead. There are 400 of those deployed. But about 2/3 of those Minutemen actually could carry 3 warheads if they wanted to add the warheads on. If you look at the submarine-launched ballistic missile, the Trident D5, that can carry a maximum of 8 warheads, but on average now carries about 4.5 warheads. Again, those warheads could be added on. And it seems to me that there's a lot of thinking now going on in the Pentagon that the limitations, the numbers in New START are too constraining for the United States, given what's happening in China and this need to develop to deal with 2 nuclear peers. So I fear we are on the verge of an arms race.
And then what do you think about Ukraine? Do you think it was a mistake that it gave up its nuclear weapons?
I helped negotiate that. I mean, no, this was an issue where I heard from Ukrainians, this was after I left government service, that they'd actually considered keeping the nuclear weapons, and they concluded that they did not have the financial resources or the infrastructure to maintain an independent nuclear deterrent. I also think that stepping back, had Ukraine kept nuclear weapons, the developments, the very positive developments in its relationship with the United States, with Europe, with NATO, the European Union would never happen. It might not have been as ostracized as North Korea, but it might well have found itself that in a crisis against Russia, it would be facing Russia alone.
Oh, interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you for that, especially your firsthand experience with that. Now, if I can turn to you, Tong, and it's been mentioned about China increasing its nuclear weapon capacity. Why is China accelerating its nuclear program, and what does this mean for the United States and arms control in general? And how do Xi's policies differ from those of other Chinese leaders in this respect?
But China is in the process of a massive nuclear expansion that is unprecedented in China's history, and a major departure from a traditional policy of maintaining a small nuclear arsenal and maintaining a relatively relaxed nuclear posture. The Chinese government hasn't really explained its rationale behind the recent nuclear buildup. So outside observers can only speculate. My personal understanding is, increasing availability of resources and money is part of the story. If we go back and read all the Chinese military and nuclear doctrinal writings, actually the Chinese military had developed an interest in a greater nuclear capability very early on, but they were limited by resources. And previous Chinese leaders, they recognized the importance of prioritizing economic development for China's overall regime security and long-term sustainability of the system. But with increasing economic development, the military, had access to greater resources, technological capacity. The current wave of nuclear buildup, according to U.S. government assessments, started at least around 2010, which was before Xi Jinping came to power. And the current Chinese buildup is also comprehensive in nature. It looks like China is basically symmetrically promoting all types of nuclear weapon technologies, land-based, sea-based, airborne, road mobile, silo-based, and is experimenting with new types of delivery systems, and has been demonstrating greater interest in new operational postures, such as rapid response capability and launch on warning or launch under attack capability. So, China is really emulating a lot of American and Russian capabilities and postures. And Chinese military strategists often talk openly that China, it is unfair for China to, never develop similar capabilities that the other major military powers have obtained and maintained for decades. As China sets its goal to become a world-class military by 2049, 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, China feels it deserves to acquire many of the similar capabilities. So increasing resource availability is really facilitating that long-standing interest and ambition. But a new difference especially under President Xi Jinping, is that he also has developed genuine and deep threat perceptions at the strategic level towards the United States and US-led Western countries. And somehow he seems to believe that if China can demonstrate stronger strategic military capability, especially nuclear capabilities, that would have a broader impact on Americans' overall policy towards China. Somehow a bigger Chinese nuclear arsenal could soften America's overall policy towards China. And he made a very explicit reference to the Russian example by praising Russia to make the right decision and maintaining an equally powerful nuclear arsenal as United States after the end of the Cold War, despite Russian economic difficulties, implying that, again, a bigger nuclear arsenal could translate into broader coercive leverage that would change and shape your enemy's overall behavior. And as he concentrates power under himself, he has really created a domestic atmosphere where open and free analytical discussions and debates about China's nuclear policy or, overall Chinese military and defense strategy, foreign policy, is becoming more difficult over time. And many traditional Chinese nuclear experts, both civilian and military, they are playing a more marginalized role in China's internal nuclear policy deliberation, to the extent that many Chinese prominent nuclear policy and arms control experts, they found out about China's nuclear modernization program on foreign newspapers, and they even today they feel very puzzled about the military rationale driving China's nuclear buildup. So under Xi, the system as a whole is becoming more internally closed and secretive. It is harder to introduce necessary internal checks and balances from the expert community. That's why the military, the defense industry have a freer hand to pursue capability that that benefit those domestic actors.
Well, thank you. That's fascinating about the divisions there, that some don't know what the others are doing. That's very interesting. Now I've got one more question before we turn to the Q&A. So if participants would like to, our audience would like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and I will look at all of them once we finish this initial conversation. So the final question will be for all three of you, and I will start with you, Alexandra. Do you see any willingness by the nuclear powers to create new arms control frameworks at this time? What could prompt them to come to the table, and what would happen if they choose not to come to the table?
So there are, as I mentioned, some signals that there may be room for dialogue, but we aren't talking about problems that could be solved with one meeting or a tweet. The work that needs to be done is going to require months and years, if not decades, of sustained support. And in an era where it's hard to get patience and persistence, those are the two things that we're really going to need. But we are fully capable of finding ways forward. To paraphrase JFK, we made these problems, so we can fix them. But in terms of what can incentivize action, I think offering dialogue without preconditions is a start. It will also be important to not dwell on every single thing that each side has done wrong in the past, and everyone has made decisions that I think in hindsight they might revisit. So, be informed by the past, mindful of the past, but don't get trapped by it. Finger pointing isn't going to get us really anywhere. In terms of why they would go to the table, it's in the interest of the U.S., Russia, and China to move forward with nuclear risk reduction measures for their own safety and security. Before we even get to the fact that everyone else on the planet is affected by whether or not these countries start to really re-engage or engage for the first time in substantive risk reduction conversations. The idea that there's some way to escape mutually assured destruction or the idea of mutual vulnerability is just something that we need to finally and fully reject. The only way to truly maintain and improve stability is through tedious and dogged diplomacy, the kinds of things that Ambassador Pifer and others have worked on, and they don't always work forever. These structures have to be built and maintained and sometimes altered, augmented, or you start and you build something new. But it's sort of a never-ending process and does require leader-level interest. In terms of what happens if we don't come back, we're looking at a three-way nuclear arms race. And unfortunately, I think the luck, and it is luck that we've experienced for the last 80 years, is going to run out.
Great, thank you. So really, so much of it depends on the leadership and the willingness of that leadership to do the hard work, right?
I will add, it's the leadership, but you also have to have a good team underneath, because the people who actually go and negotiate the brass tacks of these types of agreements are, a legion of experts, of lawyers, diplomats, scientists, military experts that build these agreements. New START that we talked about, I think, is about a 9-page treaty. There's about 900 pages of annex about how to actually implement that treaty. You have to have good, empowered staff that's not living in constant fear of losing their job.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. All right, then if I can turn to you, Steve, with the same question about, what's the state of the current, potentially new current frameworks and and prompting countries to come to the table.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not especially hopeful. The president did say about 10 days ago that he thought nuclear weapons were too expensive and he should work with Russia and China to reduce those. And I mean, that's a good thing to have him say. But if you look at the first Trump term, for the first 3 years on arms control, they did absolutely nothing. Then in 2020, they engaged with the Russians on trying to extend New START, which was due to expire in 2021. That was, in fact, extended by the Biden administration. But they went about it ham-handedly. First, they tried to pull the Chinese in, then they tried to get the Russians to make commitments on non-strategic nuclear weapons. And at the end of the day, they failed a relatively straightforward negotiation to extend New START. Now, we'll have to see how the Trump administration approaches this question now. If they do want to engage, though, it's going to be, as Alex said, a very complex negotiation. And American negotiators are not going to be able to just talk about American desires to reduce nuclear weapons. They're going to have to be prepared to address issues of interest to Russia and I think also to China. One of those would be long-range conventional strike weapons, which the Russians say now, and with some justification, can perform missions that nuclear weapons used to perform. I think they'll also have to talk about missile defense, although missile defense seems to be a declining concern on the part of the Russians, but the Russians have raised that for 15 years. And if you go back to the first Trump administration and you read their missile defense review, it said practically on every other page, do not negotiate limits on missile defense. So there's some really complex questions here. Then how do you manage the format? Do you have a US, Russia, China negotiation? The Russians will almost certainly insist that Britain and France be included. But when you have 5 countries there with very different levels of nuclear weapons, it's going to be hard to negotiate a single agreement. This will be a long process, a difficult process. It's going to require patience. And at the end of the day, the president may discover that even if we get a cap or even some reductions, he's not going to save much money. And that's because certain American systems like those ballistic missile submarines have reached the end of the service life. They're going to have to be replaced. The US Air Force wants to buy a number of very expensive intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I wonder if President Trump's interest will remain once he discovers that it's not going to save him much money, even though it could make America much safer. So I agree with Alex. I think we're now heading for a 3-way nuclear arms race. It will go for several years at least. And my hope is it won't go too far before we remember the lessons that Washington and Moscow learned back in the 1960s, was if you're piling more nuclear weapons into your arsenal, but the other side is piling more nuclear weapons into its arsenal, you're not going to buy yourself more security. And that arms race, we need to come to terms and try to arrest it. And while that arms race continues, we're going to see less stability, we're going to see increased nuclear risk, and we're going to see increased costs. So I hope it's not too long before we remember the history that started the arms control process back in the 1960s.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. Lessons learned, hopefully. Now, if I can turn to you, Tong, could you let us know what would bring China to the table, and how it views the current climate of arms control?
Well, I think for the military, for the operational level people in China, the 3, at least, a number of challenges. First is, they think the U.S. nuclear capability is still are still much greater than China, and the U.S. Overall strategic intent towards China is becoming more hostile over time compared with before. So from their perspective, for China to develop a bigger nuclear capability is stabilizing, because it could help check perceived American aggression. So that's one. They don't see their China's own nuclear buildup as being problematic or destabilizing. Second, they don't appreciate American threat perception or the international threat perception towards China's nuclear buildup. The heated debate in Washington about U.S. now facing two nuclear near peers, and why that's an unprecedented threat to the United States, and that would require the United States to further strengthen its own conventional and nuclear capability to deal with these two nuclear near peers, and how Russia and China might coordinate in a nuclear threat towards the United States, or one of them might take up opportunistic aggression when the United States is already involved in another war with the other party. All of those concerns in Washington are not yet understood in Beijing. They are, generally dismissed as excuses, and so to build a basic common understanding that U.S. and other countries, they might have genuine concerns about what China has been doing is the first step towards making the two sides on the same page, and recognizing the need to discuss the current nuclear competition. And related, and thirdly, I think China hasn't become really concerned about the consequences of its nuclear buildup. Here again in Washington, there's a strong internal agreement that the United States needs to do much more to strengthen its deterrence, including to enhance its nuclear capability. But somehow I don't see a sense of genuine concern in Beijing from the likely U.S. Increasing its nuclear and non-nuclear strategic capabilities. I think until we can really highlight the cost to China, how its own behavior is causing very negative consequences for its own security, then until that happens, it's hard to encourage China to a serious discussion of its current nuclear program. And of course, those are operational level challenges. But the biggest challenge is always at the political level, because the current nuclear buildup in China is ultimately driven by a top-down process, by a clear interest among the political leadership in Beijing about very broad coercive value of nuclear weapons. So the political interest in continuing the current buildup is very strong. And as a result, there's very little incentive in the Chinese bureaucracy to proactively think through what are the arms control options for China. The lack of political interest in arms control at the political level really discourages serious discussion in the bureaucracy. So China is not well prepared for any near-term arms control discussion. So, but the positive side of that is, so far, Mr. Trump, after coming to power, has, publicly and explicitly talked about arms control, nuclear arms control, talks with China, with Russia twice. So if Trump is personally, driving this issue and putting real emphasis on it, and the fact that the Chinese leader is likely to pay real attention to Trump's priority, I think that might put some real incentive on the Chinese side to seriously consider future arms control options. There is no doubt that China wouldn't be interested in the near-term outcome in terms of arms control agreement, but at least I think there's some chance of starting an arms control engagement or arms control talk as a process of dialogue to start, for the two sides to start discussing these issues, better understanding each other's threat perceptions, better appreciate all the risks from the emerging arms race and all the risks of greater nuclear use in future military crises. I think that would still be beneficial. And of course, when there is stronger political will in Beijing in this area, it would make operational level discussion on risk reduction measures much easier to be considered and implemented. I think you're muted,
Yes.
Joanna.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, no, that's fascinating, and especially that how with the new administration, this might slowly, as you say, as a process, make China think a little bit differently, right? The conditions a bit different. So thank you for that. So now I will turn to the Q&A. And the first question I will direct to you, Alexandra. How serious is the risk of trafficking of nuclear materials if the idea of proliferation begins to spread?
Thanks for that question. It's an extremely serious problem. Governments, particularly in an accelerated push during the Obama administration, moved to lock down fissile material across the world through a multi-summit process called the Nuclear Security Summits. We made great strides. We made great strides to change domestic and international law to make sure we were better capable of stemming the tide of material proliferation, potential uses in nuclear terrorism. This process, again, requires time, commitment, and money. And when the structures that are built to sort of control these, funding for the International Atomic Energy Agency, funding for these various international groups that are helping, sustain political interest. If that goes away, those threats go up, and threats to the NPT, countries not feeling like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is really the glue that holds all these structures together. If that starts to falter, all these problems become more serious. And as I mentioned about, staffers that would potentially negotiate or help negotiate an arms control agreement, there are also staff inside, the U.S. government whose job it is to monitor, to watch for, to keep an eye on nuclear materials. And that's why, randomly firing 300 people from the National Nuclear Security Administration, realizing the mistake and then attempting to rehire, was such a dangerous move. The experts that we have in place throughout the government, particularly in the US, to focus on these, they are absolutely essential for managing problems like this. So this is the kind of thing where we need, the public to say, we want to pay for this, we want to sustain for it, we think it is a good use of our taxpayer dollars, and we want those experts supported and stable and feeling like they do have a place and a purpose in this government.
Great. Thank you so much. And this question, maybe I'll direct to you, Steve. Does it, and you alluded a bit to this in your earlier remarks. Does the deal over Ukraine have any relation to a new nuclear arrangement between the US and Russia?
Yeah. Well, again, basically, since 2023, the Russians have refused to have any kind of conversation with the United States on issues like nuclear risk reduction, strategic stability, or what kind of follow-on agreement there might be to the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty, which expires in 2026, and actually in less than a year's time. So, you know, if there's now more engagement between Washington and Moscow, trying to help find a solution to the Russia-Ukraine war, which I have to say so far I think has been done very ineptly by the Trump administration. But does that cause Moscow to sort of lift the linkage? And there was a comment today by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, where he seemed to say, yes, we may be able to get back to strategic stability talks. So there is that offer from the Russians. Now, we'll have to see. I'm not sure the Trump administration yet has a team assembled who would be prepared to talk with the Russians on these questions. But as I said earlier, it's that conversation is not going to be just on constraining nuclear weapons. They're going to have to be prepared to discuss issues such as long-range conventional strike weapons, missile defense, that the US side has usually not been too excited to talk about.
Yeah, and then if I can follow up with you, we know that Putin had often used the nuclear threat during the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think at this point, because the Biden administration apparently really did take that threat very seriously, do you think at this point the Trump administration would take it as seriously? And do you think that Putin would risk the use of even a tactical nuclear weapon? Would he consider doing that given that things are changing on the ground for him?
Yeah, no, I think the Russians over the last 3 years have tried to use the threat of nuclear weapons to get Ukraine to give up. They've tried to use the threat of nuclear weapons to persuade the West not to send assistance to Ukraine. And what they've achieved is they have probably slowed decisions in the West. But today, the Ukrainian Air Force is flying F-16s. They have modern Western main battle tanks, long-range artillery. They slowed decisions. And I think this would be a criticism I would have of the Trump administration, the Biden administration on Ukraine, is that they said they had two goals, which was to help Ukraine and to avoid a direct NATO-Russia military clash. And those were the right two goals. But I think particularly over the last 2 years, in balancing those goals, they have been way more cautious than they needed to be. The Russians adjusted their nuclear declaratory policy in the fall of last year to the point where it's very ambiguous, but I also think it's not very credible. I mean, they tried to suggest, well, even if somebody conducts a few conventional strikes against us, we're going to use nuclear weapons. That doesn't seem very credible. How the Trump administration is going to react, I don't think we yet know.
Thank you so much. And then I'll put this toward you, Alexandra. How do smaller actors in this nuclear arena, like France, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, play a role in the strategic decisions for the United States? Could a nuclear alliance be a form of deterrence as opposed to the axis of upheaval of seen as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea? Oh, you're muted.
That's a very interesting question. I just want to quickly jump on something Ambassador Pifer said about, the Trump administration putting together a team. While they may not know who they want to sort of lead a negotiation because some of those people haven't been picked yet, I can, if it helps in the purpose of assuring the public, the good news is my bureau that I came from, Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability, was ready to go to Geneva or wherever to talk to the Russians at the drop of a hat, knowing exactly what we wanted to talk to them about in terms of next steps following New START. And I really think that the general principles that were driving what we wanted to talk about are nonpartisan and would, in fact, likely be the principles that this administration would apply, and that's one. Anything that we do would have to be in the strategic interests of the United States, our allies and partners. Seems pretty basic, but that would be the top level. Two, if it was legally binding, it has to be effectively verifiable. And three, compliance is really the key. The United States takes compliance very seriously. The Russians have not always done the same, and that is, you know, going to make things complicated when it comes to making a deal with the Russians in the future. But we've been very clear with the Russians all along. These have been our standard lines for some time, and I don't see them necessarily changing in terms of what we'd want to talk about. It's everything. As Ambassador Pifer says, it's not just the kinds of controls we already had on intercontinental delivery systems, but to expand to non-deployed systems for upload capabilities, as he mentioned, but also tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons. So the Russians know exactly what we want to talk about. It has not changed. I don't think it would change. So the good news is if they pick a person that they want to lead a delegation, the experts in the delegation are ready to go and have been ready to go. In terms of how we think about other countries, there are other nuclear armed states, and it might be confusing sometimes. There are 5 recognized nuclear weapons states, and that's the US, UK, Russia, China, France, and they're recognized under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they get the general term nuclear weapons states. Then there are other states who have proliferated since, who get referred to as nuclear armed states, and they necessarily haven't always been a part of the conversation as much as they probably should be about how we control and reduce threats. That's something that I think the P5 or the N5, as sometimes called, need to think about the discussions that probably should be happening with other nuclear armed states. North Korea is probably not one that we're necessarily ready to talk to in a multilateral sense, but it is the interest of all states, including the P5, to manage the North Korea problem. So I think they're sort of issues that can be discussed between and among, but each of those countries has sort of their own particular interests to protect. India, for example, as a nuclear armed state, has a relationship with the United States and a relationship with Russia, not a good relationship with China, but strangely does actually have some very rudimentary arms control agreements related to conventional border issues. So each of these countries could be having conversations individually or multilaterally as far as forming some group alliances. I think that's probably obviously the US and France and the UK are allies, but that might complicate things and potentially increase tension. So I think you have to think about what it is that each of these countries is trying to do in terms of their own security. But overall discussions are necessary. One place I think that everyone could be having a conversation are on issues like verification. What are the tools and technologies we can use to build agreements? We could also be talking about the issue of irreversibility. And this is a principle that all countries seemingly support, about the idea in the event that we're able to get rid of nuclear weapons, it should be an irreversible event. But what does that actually mean? What is the definition of irreversibility? How does that work in practice? It allows for countries to have a theoretical conversation about a place we might like to go without having to discuss the difficulties of getting there. And in a time where we're having trouble talking, finding ways to have conversations. Another place I think that nuclear armed and nuclear weapon states can talk is about emerging and disruptive technologies and how these technologies have the ability to destabilize the current state of affairs and how we've thought about deterrence for the last 50 years. So a lot in that space. Sorry if I didn't quite answer the question, but there's no lack of work in the space that's needed and necessary.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very large discussion, and we only have that 1 hour. I know there's so much we wish we could cover, but we're limited, unfortunately. So this question, we've had several questions about North Korea. So I will turn to you, Tong, about what does China think about North Korea's nuclear policies and arms? And secondly, how serious a threat is North Korea?
I think, the two questions are related. For China, I think China genuinely has a somewhat different threat perception towards North Korea's nuclear program. China tends to think that North Korea developed nuclear weapons to secure its regime stability and core national security interests. China doesn't think North Korea has a strong incentive to invade South Korea or provoke troubles deliberately. And I think the recent North Korean renunciation of the goal of unification with South Korea further strengthened the perception that North Korea, is retreating to a more limited strategic goal in the long run, which is to focus on its own regime and national security. So China is somewhat sympathetic to North Korea's perceived need for nuclear deterrence. China itself genuinely believes it faces very severe security threats from the United States and its Western allies. So it sees North Korea in a similar situation and therefore has less problem with North Korea wanting a nuclear deterrence. That said, China has increasingly found North Korea's nuclear program causing negative consequences for China's own security interests. North Korea could have stopped after developing a workable intercontinental ballistic missile capability with a rudimentary nuclear warhead technology, which would have provided North Korea with sufficient, even though rudimentary, deterrent. But North Korea went ahead and continued developing a comprehensive nuclear capability with very diverse types of nuclear weapons. Some of the basic modes of North Korea's nuclear weapon are really innovative and could create risks about nuclear safety and security and unauthorized nuclear use. North Korea's open emphasis on the role of tactical nuclear weapons, I think, is particularly a concern for Beijing. North Korea's doctrine of resorting to early use of tactical nuclear weapons that are going to be deployed close to the inter-Korean border. That's contradictory to China's long-standing view that nuclear powers shouldn't prioritize tactical nuclear weapons. Those are war-fighting weapons. They are more likely to be used. They can lower the threshold of nuclear conflict. They are, in other words, they are in general more dangerous. So North Korea's, emphasis on such capabilities is a concern for China. China doesn't want to be dragged in a nuclear conflict caused by North Korea on China's doorstep. And as North Korea continues developing a wide range of strategic and tactical nuclear capabilities, it only provides, from China's perspective, it only provides excuse for South Korea and Japan to strengthen security alliance relationship with the United States. It also has enhanced voices in both Seoul and Tokyo for strengthening extended nuclear deterrence relationship with Washington. there are also growing voices in South Korea in particular for indigenous nuclear weapon capabilities for South Korea. So strengthened trilateral US, South Korea, Japan security alliance is viewed by Beijing as very threatening to China's security, and indigenous nuclear capabilities for South Korea or Japan down the road is even more troublesome for China. So China is increasingly bearing the consequences of North Korea's expansive nuclear weapon program. The fact that North Korea is now cooperating with Russia by sending troops to Ukraine, which provides an excuse from China's perspective that NATO countries can now make a connection between European security and Asia-Pacific security, which again, from Beijing's perspective, provides an excuse for NATO countries to increase its military presence in East Asia. So China's worry about so-called Asian NATO has increased. If North Korea, Russia are willing to violate existing non-proliferation norms and rules through increasing Russian military technological support to North Korea, I think that would also make China uncomfortable because China, as as it perceives itself to be a future leader in the international system, it genuinely feels its interests are supported by non-proliferation norms and rules. It doesn't want to see broader proliferation of sensitive military technologies, especially in the hands of leaders like Kim Jong-un, whom China doesn't seem to trust at the fundamental level, and China seems to disagree with many of the risk-taking behaviors of the North Korean leader. So I think it presents an interesting dilemma for Beijing, even though Beijing needs to provide political protection and cover for North Korean behaviors. But on the other hand, Beijing is increasingly uncomfortable about some of the North Korea's nuclear policies, which I think, again, on the positive side, might provide some hope for increasing coordination among the major nuclear powers to address the most destabilizing elements of North Korea's nuclear program.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot to cover when you're dealing with North Korea and China. Now, in the last 2 minutes, if I could ask, it's like lightning round here, but I would like to end on a positive note. If we can, are there any low-hanging fruit that the three nuclear powers could immediately work on to achieve at least one short-term agreement? And I'll start with you, Alexandra.
Oh no, I didn't have time to think. So I would sort of go back to what I said first and foremost is committing to dialogue. Despite everything else that's going on, we need to be able to talk about strategic stability. So getting to the table, staying at the table, even when we're disagreeing, the process can help. I was able to meet as a P5 over the course of the past couple of years after the further invasion of Ukraine. And it was a little difficult at first, the conversations we were having about risk reduction, about nuclear doctrines. But the same group of people kept showing up at meetings. I particularly noticed that the Chinese delegation became far more comfortable with sort of engaging in a broader ranging conversations, getting off talking points. But it takes time, and it takes, again, patience. And I think we have to be prepared for the fact that it will be slow going. There are some things that we could do right now. A commitment to dialogue, again, that sustained dialogue, particularly if tensions are on the rise, to use the mechanisms that we have to talk with each other. I think we can recommit to general principles like the rejection of any return to explosive nuclear testing, a commitment to work in good faith at the Conference on Disarmament to talk about next steps, and also a commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are problems, but that treaty has by and large stemmed the tide of mass global proliferation, and it is worth preserving and protecting and strengthening. So I think if as a very start to trying to improve conditions, you get nuclear weapon states to commit to those things, the broader agreements and structures we need to build can follow. But again, we need that demand signal from the public. This is not something that leaders tend to hear about. After the Cold War, there was kind of like glad that's done, and people focused elsewhere. But the threat never went away, and now it's become, in fact, more complex and in many ways worse. So we really need people asking their leaders, demanding that their leaders put in the time and effort here.
Okay, great, thanks. And quickly, Steve, do you have any comment?
Well, everything that Alex just said, and I would add, I think one additional thing, it might make sense for the 3 or the 5, if you include Britain and France, but US, Russia, China, and Britain and France. Are there some easy things that you could do or on confidence and security building? So for example, Russia and the United States have an agreement to pre-notify launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. I believe that China and Russia have a similar arrangement. Well, could you take the 5 countries and have them all agree that we will notify launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and intermediate-range ballistic missiles? You know, that would seem to be a modest step, but again, it would reduce the possibility that a test launch might be misinterpreted. And that should not be too hard to do, and it would be a useful, positive step.
Great, thank you. And finally, Tong?
Well, the US and China, after long negotiation, agreed recently that they shouldn't have AI make nuclear use decisions. I think they can follow up and start talking about operation level principles to materialize or substantiate these very generic agreements, and think about how to make it more practical at the operational level as a risk reduction measure.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Alexandra, Steve, and Tong, for such a fascinating discussion. I know we've run out of time, so many more questions that we could be discussing, but anyway, I want to thank you very much and I hope it has prompted people to really look at the issue in greater detail. Just some quick housekeeping. We have an upcoming event on Wednesday, February 26th, the implications of the U.S. withdrawal from the WHO. It's an in-person members only briefing. And then we have a second event with Professor Joseph Nye, the father of so-called soft power. He's going to be speaking about soft power on the line, U.S. influence in a changing world. And that's on Thursday, March 13th. It'll be a virtual briefing like similar to this one. And then finally, we provide these briefings for free, and we're hoping that you enjoy them and would like to see them to continue. So please consider donating to Network 2020. So thank you, everyone, for participating, and to our great panelists. And we hope to see you sometime again in the near future. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.